Rylan Garver first stepped onto the orbital platform of the Rylan Concorde as the only human representative in a delegation of 70 species. He wasn't a diplomat. He wasn't even military. He was a biomechanics specialist, specifically a rehabilitation expert for spinal injuries. Why the Concorde invited him to the Interstellar Adaptability Summit, he didn't know. But Earth wanted a seat at the table, and Rylan happened to be the only one who matched the requirements: adaptable, physically fit, and available. He didn't expect laughter. Not immediately. It happened during the second day of comparative physiology demonstrations in the Arcaneum, a towering hall of crystalline walls and gravity-variable platforms. The Concorde's idea of diplomacy was oddly physical. Species took turns showcasing their biological uniqueness. The Varex demonstrated their triple lung endurance by sprinting nonstop for 6 hours. The Drelthi lifted a steel pillar the size of a shuttle using only their back tendrils. Then came Rylan's turn. He stepped onto the platform, adjusted the gravity to Earth's standard 1G, and waited while the others recalibrated their expectations. "Is that your full skeletal support?" asked CERN, a 6-legged rithari with glistening ridges along his thorax. "Yeah," Rylan said, rotating his shoulder. "This is it." CERN emitted a whirring chuff that passed for laughter among his species. Hollow-boned avians have sturdier frameworks. Other aliens joined in. Some clattered their spines. Others blinked in patterns that meant amusement. Rylan didn't respond. He simply stepped forward, wrapped his hands around the base of the Concorde's standard mass block, 200 kilograms of alloyed beryllium, and straightened his back. "Wait," said a Varellan attendant. "You cannot. Human skeletal limits are logged at." Rylan grunted. The block lifted an inch. Then 2. Then he stood upright, holding the massive weight across his chest. His face turned crimson, veins bulging at his temples. He didn't say anything. He simply held it, took 2 steps, and set it down without dropping it. The room fell silent. Even the Drelthi retracted their back tendrils in stunned stillness. "Impossible," CERN said flatly. "Your bones should have fractured under axial load." Rylan exhaled and rubbed his forearms. "Yeah, well, we trained for this." "But your bones are not fused," shouted a Flarnic observer. "They are individual segments pressed by tendons and meat." Rylan chuckled wearily. "We're not built for it, but we do it anyway." Later that evening, while his arms ached and his lower back throbbed from the effort, Rylan sat quietly in the habitat dome, drinking electrolyte broth and massaging his wrists. He knew he'd pay for that stunt in the morning. Maybe longer. A soft hum preceded the door's opening. A Varellan stepped in, tall, amber-skinned, and wearing a flow robe that shimmered like a heat mirage. "I'm Envoy Nera," she said. "May I sit?" Rylan nodded. "Sure. You have disrupted the comparative scale matrix for skeletal resilience. Our data models no longer align." "Sorry about that." Nera tilted her head. "You are not designed for such feats, yet you perform them." "Why?" Rylan leaned back. "Because we don't like being told what we can't do." "That is illogical. Choosing to perform above safe thresholds invites injury." "It does," he said, rotating his shoulder again. "But sometimes, pushing past those limits is the only way we get stronger." Nera studied him for a long moment. "We have recorded your performance for analysis. There are inquiries." "Inquiries. You are now part of the enhanced specimen study. Your participation is mandatory. Medical scans commence at cycle dawn." He stared at her. "Wait, I didn't sign up for." "You lifted twice your body mass. That places you in the anomaly bracket." Before he could argue, she exited. The next morning, Rylan was scanned, poked, prodded, and subjected to gravitational stress simulations. His lower back lit up red on the musculoskeletal scan, confirming what he already suspected: he had a lumbar strain. No fractures, thankfully. He was prescribed rest and a muscle recovery regimen. Rest didn't come easy. Word of his feat had spread. Aliens who'd previously ignored him now followed him around, asking questions about bone density, tendon elasticity, and pain thresholds. He answered as much as he could, though the novelty wore thin quickly. On the 4th day, the Concorde introduced a challenge sequence, an obstacle course designed to test adaptability under randomized gravity and environmental conditions. No one expected Rylan to participate, not with his injury. He didn't either, until he saw the list of registered species and noticed CERN's name at the top. CERN noticed him too. "You will spectate?" "Yes," the Rithari asked. "Your lumbar segments are inflamed." "I'll be fine," Rylan said, stretching carefully. You risk further damage. You should withdraw. Rylan hesitated. His lower back still ached, and the pain spiked with sudden movement. But something in Cern's tone pushed him. I'm in. The course was brutal. Artificial windstorms, zero-gravity leaps, magnetic wall climbs. Rylan couldn't match the sheer speed of the Varex or the flexibility of the sling, but he endured. When a shifting wall collapsed and trapped a Varellan beneath it, Rylan was the one who pulled the debris off using raw grit and shaky legs. He finished 6th overall, but he finished. He collapsed afterward, breathing hard, sweat soaking through his shirt. A Concord medic scanned him immediately. Moderate lumbar tear. You should not have competed. I know, he said, wincing as they attached a neural analgesic patch. You will require physical therapy and rest. At least 4 weeks. Got it. He spent the next few days in recovery chambers, floating under low gravity while his spine slowly healed. The Concord provided advanced muscle stimulators and tissue repair fields, but even with their tech, no miracles happened. Healing was healing. It took time. Nara visited him during his 3rd recovery session. You defy logical parameters repeatedly, she said. Not trying to. Just doing what I can. You risked permanent damage to aid another. That is not an efficient calculation. Maybe not, Rylan said, adjusting the stimulator pad on his back. But some things are worth the risk. She stood quietly for a moment. There will be another demonstration. In 5 cycles. Will you participate? If I'm cleared. You are becoming unsettling to some. Your biology is fragile, yet you persist. He managed a tired smile. That's kind of what we do. By the end of the week, Rylan was cleared for light activity. He didn't push it. He knew better. But he noticed the change. Aliens who once scoffed now watched him with measured interest. Some even asked for training tips. He began holding short sessions in the dome gym, teaching basic resistance exercises adapted for non-human anatomy. He kept it mild, careful. But the aliens kept coming. Even Cern. I wish to understand your training methodology, the Rithri said, stepping onto the mat one morning. You laughed at my bones. I did. I also saw you lift over twice your mass and tear your back muscles doing it. So now you're curious. Yes. Your inefficiency fascinates me. Rylan tossed him a resistance band. Let's start with core stabilization. If your species has something like a core, I have thoracic stabilizers. Will that suffice? We'll make it work. By the time the final summit day arrived, Rylan's spine was still healing, but his role had shifted. He wasn't just a curiosity anymore. He was a teacher, a collaborator. The Concord had even asked for a full biomechanical report from Earth, citing his adaptability as a case study in cross-species resilience. As he packed his things, Nara met him at the exit dock. You lifted beyond your limits in tissue. Then you trained others while recovering. This is not normal. No, Rylan said, slinging his bag over his shoulder. It's human. She studied him. At last, she said, we will remember. Then she turned and walked away. The first real problem started 3 days after he got back to Earth. Rylan was still on medical leave, still nursing the deep tissue healing protocol and walking with that subtle half-hitch step that meant his lumbar was protesting, but not loudly enough to stop him. He'd just finished a morning hydrotherapy session when his wrist console blinked red with an encrypted transmission. Not standard Earth protocol encryption Concord seal, diplomatic channel. He tapped it open, squinting against the glare of the pool's edge. A holographic image flickered to life, projected just above his palm. Nara, centered and still, though her usually fluid expression was tighter than he remembered. There is a situation, she said. You've been requested. Not as a delegate. As an interventionist. The message ended before he could ask what that even meant. By dusk, he was rerouted through an orbital slipgate and on a shuttle bound for the Concord's remote biome station on the exoplanet Drelker 5, a place Rylan had never heard of, which usually meant something had gone sideways. The station was low gravity, high humidity, and smelled faintly of ozone and overcooked protein. He was greeted not by Nara, but by a small, translucent being with a mass suit that hissed every time it moved. You are the human specialist? It asked, rotating a membrane in what might have been uncertainty. You do not have additional limbs. I get that a lot, Rylan said, adjusting his pack. What exactly do you need an interventionist for? 3 species have suffered physiological destabilization following cross-adaptive strain protocols. The sequence was based on your summit demonstration logs. They tried to copy my methods? No, they tried to accelerate past them. Rylan dropped his pack and followed the being as scifi. If he remembered the anatomy, right down a corridor lined with tension cabling and atmospheric seals. The walls were marked with warning glyphs, most of which he couldn't read, but the red ones were universal. 2 sliding doors later, he was standing in what looked like a medbay designed by a committee that couldn't agree on gravity. The floor plates tilted slightly, hovering above magnetic runners, and the room was divided by translucent barriers housing 3 separate patients. The first was a Valaria species with hydraulic musculature and semi-rigid cartilage endoskeletons. The individual inside the enclosure was twitching in arrhythmic spasms, every few seconds venting steam from its dorsal valves. Muscle feedback loop, Rylan said, stepping closer. What did they do? Attempted a 0G resistance cycle with weighted axial load, the scifi replied. They used your summit values as a baseline. They're not human. Their tissue can't tolerate eccentric strain like that. The being didn't respond. The second enclosure held something coiled and feather-scaled. Rylan didn't recognize the species, but the readout showed rapid internal hemorrhaging and vascular collapse. The last enclosure held CERN. Rylan stopped cold. The Rithri's thoracic segments were bound in a constriction harness, and his lower limbs were immobilized. A dull green fluid was being cycled through his circulatory system, likely an artificial stabilizer. He tried to replicate your vertical lift maneuver, the scifi said. He failed. Rylan stepped into the interface zone and tapped the barrier pad. CERN's eyes, normally a gleaming iridescent, were dimmed and unfocused. Why would he try that without support? He insisted it was essential to understanding human core mechanics. That's not how any of this works, Rylan muttered. He spent the next 4 hours combing through the adaptation logs. The Concorde had turned his summit performance into a study template, and someone had greenlit open access. Dozens of species had interpreted his exertion as a training threshold, not a warning. No one had accounted for human pain tolerance, compensatory micro-adjustments, or the fact that humans routinely did things that hurt them because they believed it made them stronger. They'd misunderstood the whole point. He demanded the training simulations be shut down across all Concorde-linked stations. When resistance came from the station's administrator, a 3-eyed bureaucrat in a floating chair who insisted the data had motivational value, Rylan walked into the central server room and manually disabled the adaptation modules. That got their attention. By the next local morning, Nara arrived. You could have requested a formal override, she said, stepping into the makeshift triage room where Rylan was applying tension release gel to the Valari's overstimulated muscle junctions. They were replicating human strain thresholds without understanding basic recovery cycles. Your protocols were going to kill someone. You were the demonstration model. They believed the limits were safe. I never said they were, he snapped, standing. I dragged myself through that summit with a torn lumbar and a stim patch. That wasn't a fitness routine, it was barely controlled desperation. Nara's expression shifted, but only slightly. They mistook your effort for capability. Because you let them. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped past him and into CERN's enclosure. The Rithri had regained partial consciousness, though his breathing was shallow and his dorsal ridges drooped. You were foolish, Nara said to him. This was not intended as instruction. I required understanding, CERN murmured. He lifted beyond capacity. I wish to know the edge. You nearly lost function in your lower limbs. Then I have found the edge. Rylan exhaled slowly. I'm going to need a rehab suite, he said. And I'll need consent from each of them before starting any recovery protocol. You intend to rehabilitate all 3? If they're willing. I'm not letting them become case studies in misapplied determination. Later that cycle, he began with the Valari. The muscle feedback loop had subsided, but the residual twitching made motor control difficult. Rylan constructed a makeshift hydrostatic resistance chamber from 2 atmospheric pumps and a sealed cargo container. The Valari's muscles responded well to controlled water displacement, gentler than gravity, but still challenging. It worked. By the second rotation, the feather-scaled patient had stabilized enough for guided micro-movement therapy. Rylan used vibration pads and slow oscillation fields to stimulate vascular regeneration. It was delicate work, requiring constant adjustment. He barely slept. On the 5th rotation, CERN attempted to stand. Rylan intercepted him just before he collapsed. Not yet, he said, easing the Rithri back onto the support frame. I feel no pain. That's not a good thing. CERN tilted his head. You trained in damage recovery. You are not a warrior. Why did you push beyond your own limits? Because sometimes the only way people take you seriously is if you show them how far you're willing to go. That is madness. Yeah, but it works. By the end of the 8th cycle, all 3 patients could walk unassisted. Nara returned again, this time without formality. I reviewed your methods, she said. You modified every technique between species. You built equipment from salvage. You did not request a single assistant. I didn't have time. You restored functionality to 3 incompatible physiologies. No one on this station has ever done that. I'm not trying to impress anyone. You already have. Which is why the Concorde has a new request. Rylan crossed his arms. I'm listening. There is a species in the Outer Rim. They have no word for recovery. They believe damage is final. Their leadership has requested human instruction in post-trauma restoration. He blinked. You want me to teach them? That healing is possible? Yes. He looked past her at the 3 patients still completing their final rehab session. They were quiet, focused, moving slowly but deliberately. All right, he said, but I'm going to need better supplies. Rylan stood ankle-deep in dust under an ochre sun, squinting up at the jagged peaks that ringed the settlement. The air on Korath 9 was thin and dry, filtered through a series of atmospheric scrubbers that hummed low in the distance. He had arrived 2 days prior, after a transport delay due to solar interference, and was already regretting the single-layer jumpsuit the Concorde had issued him. It clung to his back, soaked through from climbing the settlement's central ridge to assess the terrain. The Korvathi greeted him without ceremony. They didn't shake hands. They didn't bow, nod, or offer translation implants. They simply stood in a half-circle, silent and unmoving, while Rylan tried to determine which of them was the leader. All right, he said, dropping his pack to the ground. I'm here to show you how to recover from injury. That's what I do. Your envoy requested this. None responded. One blinked slowly, horizontal membranes sliding shut over deep violet eyes, but no one spoke. He tapped his console and brought up the biometric scanner. I'll need to do a basic survey. Muscle tone, joint range, oxygen saturation. Just diagnostics. Still nothing. Rylan sighed. Okay, how about this? I'll demonstrate. You can watch. He pulled a tension strap from his pack and looped it around a jagged stone protruding from the ground. With a practiced motion, he dropped into a squat, extending one leg forward and leaning into the movement. The stretch pulled at his glutes and hamstrings, lighting up the still recovering fibers in his lower back. Notice the controlled descent, he said. I'm using eccentric contraction to build joint stability. This is useful after strain. The Korvathi watched. No blinking, no shifting. He stood, wiped his hands on his pants, and pointed to one of the taller ones. You. Come try. The being didn't move. But then, after a long pause, it walked to the stone, lowered itself into a squat, and held the position for exactly 3 seconds before its left leg buckled. It toppled sideways and didn't brace its fall. The impact kicked up a plume of dust. Rylan knelt beside it immediately. You all right? Anything feel torn? The Korvathi sat up and rotated its shoulder twice, deliberate, slow, and stared at the ground. You didn't try to catch yourself. Still nothing. Do you not react to falling? Another Korvathi approached, this one with a lattice of bioluminescent scarring across its forearms. We do not interrupt failure. It completes itself. That's the whole problem, Rylan said, standing. You believe injury is a conclusion, not a process. But it isn't. It's a signal. Recovery isn't denial of damage, it's a response to it. The scarred one tilted its head. We have no examples of what you describe. Then that's why I'm here. Over the next 12 hours, he built a makeshift lab using modular scaffolds and whatever equipment the settlement had in storage, mostly mining gear and agricultural tools. No medical kits. No splints. Not a single compression wrap. He improvised. By dusk, he had rigged a pulley system using irrigation lines and counterweights to simulate resistance bands. He tied a Korvathi's arm to the rig and had it perform slow, repetitive pulls. Don't just yank. Control the motion. That's where the real work happens. A third Korvathi, smaller than the others, with shorter thoracic ridges, watched from a distance. It took 3 cycles before it approached and placed its hand on the pulley rope without prompting. That night, he ate ration bars alone and reviewed the day's biometric logs. None of the participants had elevated their heart rates during the exercises. No adrenaline spikes. No cortisol surges. Their bodies responded to exertion, but their minds didn't register threat or discomfort. He recorded a note. Absence of pain response suggests either cultural suppression or evolved disassociation. We'll test with calibrated nerve stim tomorrow. The following morning, he set up a pain threshold test using a modified heat plate. He explained the procedure to the volunteer: apply pressure with the palm until the sensation became uncomfortable, then release. The Korvathi placed its hand on the plate and left it there. For nearly a full minute, smoke began to rise. Rylan yanked the hand away and plunged it into a mineral coolant basin. You were supposed to stop. It was not unbearable. You were blistering. This is not failure. It is change. He stared at the hand. Skin reddened, but not peeling. The tissue, despite the exposure, showed minimal trauma. He ran a scan. Your nociceptors are underdeveloped. We do not require them. You absolutely do. He spent the next 2 days teaching basic first aid, how to identify swelling, how to immobilize a limb, how to elevate an injury. The Korvathi learned fast. They didn't argue, didn't question, they simply absorbed. But they still didn't react to their own pain. One dislocated a shoulder during a balance test and didn't even flinch. Your nervous systems are tuned to ignore damage, he told the group during a mid-cycle debrief. But that doesn't mean healing isn't necessary. You're walking around with injuries that haven't recovered in years. That is our way, one replied. We endure. Enduring isn't the same as healing. The smaller one approached. You continue despite your own injuries. I do, but I also repair. That's the difference. Later that cycle, he initiated the final test, assisted trauma response. He simulated a crush scenario using a weighted beam and instructed the participants to extract the victim, a weighted dummy, without exacerbating the injury. The first attempt failed. They lifted the dummy by the neck and dragged it. No. Stabilize the spine first. Then roll laterally. You're trying to preserve function, not just relocate mass. The second attempt went better. The third succeeded completely. On the final day, he gathered them around the rig. You've learned to identify injury, to treat it, to prevent further damage. But the biggest lesson is this: pain isn't weakness. It's information. You can choose to ignore it, but you'll miss what it's telling you. The scarred one stepped forward. You have altered our understanding of failure. I didn't change your biology. I just showed you that damage doesn't have to be permanent. The smaller Korvathi raised its hand, a gesture he hadn't seen from them before. Will you return? No, Rylan said. You won't need me to. That evening, as the shuttle lifted from the ridge, he looked down at the settlement. The pulley rig was still visible, and he could see 2 Korvathi practicing joint mobility drills in the dust. They moved slowly, deliberately, but they moved. That was enough.